I'm not really sure how to go through this one. It's reverse engineering an emotion. And this phrase came to mind as a way of remembering what one author was talking about in terms of how it's possible for a book to be successful even when it's bad. And I think it was a she, said that it's not necessarily about a book having good structure or plot or even necessarily characters, but it's about how it elicits an emotion in the reader. And maybe this is for that author's particular bias because she's got a particular kind of audience, right? So you can say something like, if you're writing for young girls, what is successful in the market is like X. Whether or not you should be writing for that, or whether or not you're omitting a huge audience, or like whether it's true or not, like the numbers say this, so some authors will examine it and make assumptions and all this kind of stuff. I mean, in the end, you get paid, right? So there's a lot of the art that kind of falls away, and there's a lot of the humanization that kind of falls away. And even in the sense of this writing for emotion, it is technically, in a sense, dispassionate. It's weird. Writing for emotions that in a way that's dispassionate is taking advantage of the way work is received. So what this author was saying is that it's important that a work elicit emotion, whatever it is, and that the writing should be focused around that, and that some of the can't say something like the author didn't say this, so I can imagine something like the worst books, some of the best books in history were pretty bad, but because they elicited emotion in some sense in their readers, and because of other factors, they became successful. So let's avoid books that were popular because of the times, so based on politics or culture or social, whatever the heck. So we look at, think about more or less classic stuff. Even today, there are books like, I think this author might have actually been talking about, when people talk about books that are bad but are popular, well, you can be like, okay, well, in 2019, right, what would be the books that have been recently popular? Well, you could say something like Harry Potter, but that's not new. You could say something like Tolkien, that's not new. You could say something, and you're probably linking it first to movies and then going back and thinking, well, the book was popular, that's why it got turned into movies. That's not a good way of thinking of it. You could think something like 50 Shades of Grey, which I haven't read it. I'm probably never, hopefully never going to need to read it. And like, who knows, you need to understand your audience or something like that. So you go and look at the books that they like, and you go, okay, well, if that's the audience that I want to capture, what do they like? What can I do that would interest them? Like, you study the market. And for writing for emotion, it is something like that. So you look at what sticks in people's memory, what makes them feel certain ways. And I've been thinking about the idea of reverse engineering that, which is having emotions in mind and then trying to discover, in the context of your fictional universe, let's say, what actions, what characters, what personality traits for those characters, what events, so plot, what things could lead to that emotion, that set of emotions, that set of emotions in that order. So you could actually, so for example, for movie writing, because there are huge constraints for movie writing. Entire movies can be made out of short stories, and what movie, let's say it's an original movie, it gets created, and you get a like a plot line and the characters and all this kind of stuff, and then there are like moments that are thought about, like this has to be exciting here, and that this has to be the threat of failure and all this kind of stuff, and you go, oh, no, and make a chart, and then in the uniqueness of that movie universe, let's say it's an original property, you might say, well, we need this at the end, therefore that needs to be written in over here. So you're kind of like writing it backwards after at some point. And so you write it forward and figure some stuff out and write it backwards and deposit the things that need to be there to make the, and you've got only so much screen time to work with, so it has to be pretty constrained. So you can't have a bunch of irrelevant stuff. So I mean, for a really attentive moviegoer that just has that brain and spoils everything for themselves, hopefully just for themselves, they'll actually see every single little thing that gets kind of dropped in that's slightly, that maybe requires just a touch of suspension of disbelief. They'll okay, well, that's going to be useful later. That object, that thing, that comment, that background for a character, that whatever. And I'm wondering if something similar, like writing it backwards, could be done in terms of thinking of an emotion. Like okay, so I'm working on a book and I've got a bunch of other writing on the go. And so for the book, I don't think like that, actually. Maybe I should. Which is, do I need to have these characters act like this or feel like this? And do I want the reader to feel a certain way when certain things are happening, or when certain characters are feeling a certain way? And if I identify that I want this kind of feeling in the reader, I could look at that and say, well, does this chapter, this scene, this sentence convey what I want in order to elicit that emotion, to pull it out, to make it, to really, really snap it into place? And maybe this is unspoken because it's just instinct, and good writers don't really think of things like this. And maybe it's not something that can really be taught. Even if I'm kind of articulating something, I'm not giving instructions as to how that actually works. I don't even know if I can give good examples, certainly not in the context of my writing, because I'm not spoiling stuff. I don't want to spoil stuff. And maybe after the fact, right? Like on my deathbed, I talk about stuff like where or things, right? Stuff that I just don't want to talk about. Stuff that I shouldn't talk about because that's part of the package that's being presented to individuals. So talking and not talking can be equally important, even though I desperately want to share all kinds of stuff, even when I don't really know how. And I'm going to have audience members that are smarter than me and can probably figure stuff out really, really well. And I don't like... There's this thing where I have thought 10 books ahead. I think that's almost literally true. So I've got plot lines and plot lines within plot lines and things all tied together. And I'll have smart people say, aha, I know where this is going. And then I can't say, well, yeah, you're totally right. 3 books from now, I'm going to explore that thing. Something. Because that's a defensive mechanism where they'll act on something. I learned this from games creators talking about this kind of topic, where if they have suggestions for features for a game and the game implements them, the player says, hey, that I get credit for that. That was my idea. See proof here. But the game creator already had that in mind, perhaps sketched out in an actual long-term plan, and might not have ever noticed that idea, or might have seen that idea and gone, cannot respond, must not respond, because it's a spoiler, right? It's the revelation of the future of that video game. There's something in the same kind of vein for writing for a series or for a fictional universe, multiple works for that universe. And so I can't. In order to best serve the loves of an audience or a future audience for those individuals, I must not, I must not engage in the kind of personal satisfaction of saying things up front, or the fear that would have me need to say things up front to preempt smart people from giving ideas and claiming that the ideas came from them and stuff like that. I've got to like sit on my hands, bite my tongue kind of thing. So reverse engineering for emotion. So I might be able to say something like, I need a sense of so my book, and I can talk about this because I've got the first couple of sentences actually up and published. I've reworked them a couple times, so I'll have to update the website, worldswithwords.com. And I immediately start with a kind of fear that I've never heard articulated properly. And it's out there, and there's just a certain kind of person who I happen to be, so there's authenticity there. Where they might not have actually directly engaged in the thought. So I'll present the thought and just right in the opening moment have everything that the book and I and the universe, my fictional universe, everything that's about is right up front. So I start with this fear, and then so I could like, some people will have cue cards and they'll write down plot elements or characters and what's going on and all this kind of stuff, and that's good, right? An author needs to discover what tools work for them, or use the tools even if they don't think they work for them, because they're the tools that need to be used, etc. But there's an equivalent. We're writing down emotions. I need this kind of unsettling dread, and I need to have that in the thread that's an undercurrent. So I'll have it like a hammer right up front, and then I'll have that be the primary motivation of this character, and I'll have it be an undercurrent throughout the novel, and then I'll just occasionally remind the reader that it's still there, that it's still important to have them, oh yeah, okay, all that stuff is because of this thing that I misplaced in my memory for a moment. So maybe a book would do that, and maybe there's so like humans have relationships. Go figure. That's kind of how we propagate more humans. And so you could talk in a book about the relationship between multiple people, and it could be, siblings or friends. It could be co-workers, right? So there could be an emotion that's important for that particular relationship, and that could be a unit of description that's just as important as the description of the background of a character, even though that background isn't necessarily elaborated on. So reading a novel is kind of like being on a train, and you're being, obviously, because the text goes letter after letter, the train goes down the track, and there's an idea where the plot and everything is fixed, but there are windows on the train. So a reader can look outside, can see and imagine the background of the characters that are not necessarily plot elements, but they're there. They're kind of like window dressing that's really important. Like being on a tube that's moving is different from being on a train with windows that's moving. And so there's like the internal plot element instruction stuff, which is like the inside of the cabin, and then there's all the background and stuff. And then the reader's imagination can go wild, and they can imagine what's beyond the hills, what's over the hills that they can't see past. And having so back to emotion. The emotion is kind of like the stuff that's outside the windows, that's out in the background. It's the green of the grass. And I could see emotion as being one of the bullet points in a cue card of details of a particular character, or that describe a set of events in a scene. So, loss and empathy and fear, and maybe it's as blunt, as kind of amateur as those kinds of words, but maybe there are more subtle words or even phrases that an author to be can write and to keep in mind when they're writing a scene, when they're trying to ask themselves, like, well, what is motivating that character right now? Like, how should that character respond? And if all they have is like the background, the childhood and stuff like that, that's not necessarily inspiring enough for a lot of writers. So if there was a little bit of emotion, like this character grew up under these circumstances, fine. Some facts that are over the hills that aren't necessarily, that are really, really important for the author to understand the character, and then write down a couple of emotions maybe from that hidden childhood, and have them wrapped around the personality traits of the character. So there's a word I particularly want to use, which I can't think of course, because I'm talking about it. So if there are certain kinds of neuroses, so you've got like a neuroticism level for the particular character, and if you know that, and if you define that, and if the writer says something like, these events were about fear, this character was involved, this character has a sensitivity to fear, that it's a defensive person because of the background that's not being talked about ever, and so that triggers that character's defensive nature. And so when that character is in this other scene, now I know what that feeling, which I wanted, what that feeling's doing to my characters, and now I want my reader to empathize with the situation that this character's gone through and how that character is feeling. And it's not like saying that's the justification, but it kind of is. I mean, so the character feels a certain way and acts a certain way in it. And if in that particular character, in that particular scene, the author wants the reader to be drawn in and really hurt with that character, and that is the success of that chapter, let's say, and that's the goal, then the idea of all of this is that as long as that conveyance is successful, then there's a lot of things that can be forgiven. So there are different kinds of readers. So let's just talk about pulp fiction, of like the kinds of readers who don't put the brakes on when they see like a grammar nuance that they don't agree with. And that, so like a normal person, not a literary critic or something like that. So like a good person, and they they come away at the end of the book and all they have are some of the memories and some of the scenes and the events and the plot and all of these feelings from one to the next to the next to the next. And they'll look back and they'll say, wow, I was really sad and I was worried and then I got excited and hopeful and terrified, and all of those were on the cue cards for all of the emotions that the author wanted on purpose, that was creating to craft, to convey to the reader. And if all that happens, the more potently that happens is the more forgiving a reader will be, let's say. And the more this writer who is giving this kind of advice was that emotional success, that author was saying that's where the success in at least those books comes from. And it's not about the grammar, it's not about the plot. As weird and insulting as those things are, it's like all of those other things, all the characters, all the backgrounds, all the plot, the grammar, the spelling, all serve the emotion. They have to be at a certain level, right? But once that level is somehow achieved, the real success, the return on investment in terms of writing well, the return on investment comes from somehow conveying emotion. So yeah, that came from a sentence.